Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Shared Leadership, How Better Team Dynamics Can Improve Organizational Effectiveness. We're very excited to have you here today. My name is Lucy Sullivan, and I'll be your host for today. And before we begin, I'm just going to cover a couple of quick housekeeping things. We are recording today's webinar, so you will get a link to the recording and the slides, and we'll also follow up with a blog post that has a lot of the key points and some Q&A with our experts. That'll all come to you via email, so don't worry about that. Due to the size of our group today, everyone is, of course, in listen-only mode and your cameras are off, but we absolutely want to hear from you throughout the broadcast. So probably all of you are familiar with Zoom at this point, but you just navigate to that Q&A icon right at the bottom. You can put in questions at any time during the webinar. You don't need to hold them for a certain point. Those will come straight to me, and we will get to as many as we can during the broadcast. And we'll also then follow up on any that we didn't get to. We will follow up on those after the session. So please just put those in at any time, and comments, of course, additional resources on this topic are always welcome as well. I will give you now just a brief introduction of who MRG is and who's going to be guiding you through our content today. MRG is a global leader in designing assessments that impact people in profound and meaningful ways. And we have solutions for leadership, motivation, personal development, sales, service. They're insightful, they are research-backed, and they're designed with action-inspiring feedback and to help people foster a deep sense of self-awareness so they can pursue growth. MRG was founded more than 35 years ago, approaching 40 now, and our assessments have been used by thousands of certified practitioners in more than 100 countries around the world. They're available in many languages. And we have two presenters today. You'll have Trisha Nadiff and Drew Rand. And Trisha is the president of MRG, and she's been working with individuals, teams, organizations for more than 30 years in consulting and coaching, product design, research. You may have seen her speak elsewhere. She also shares MRG research around the world. She's presented here in Maine, but you may have also seen her at events like ATD, Society for Consulting Psychology. She's been a TEDx speaker, contributor to Association Coaching Magazine. And Drew is based here in our Portland office as well. And he's been with MRG as an IO psychologist for just a couple of years and made a very big impact in that time. He also has a breadth of experience in consulting and developing leadership programs as a coach and working with developing our products. And Drew has an endless curiosity for assessments and plays a very important role in designing and creating those as well. So without further ado, I will hand things over to our experts.
Thank you, Lucy. Welcome, everybody. As many of you may know, Drew and Lucy and I are all speaking to you from the US. And so you may know that we are in the midst of making a choice as a country about who will be our leader for the next 4 years. We know many of you are with us here in the States and are probably feeling the need to refresh your news feed on a regular basis. So as Lucy said, no worries. We are recording this. An interesting time, I think, for all of us to be talking about the idea of shared leadership. So thank you for joining us. We appreciate your sharing your time with us on this particular morning. So our agenda today, we're going to talk about how expectations for leadership have changed so dramatically over the last many decades. We're going to talk to you a little bit about some of our research and how our research has led us to the point of a strong belief in the notion of shared leadership. We're going to talk to you about how neuroscience has informed our thinking about shared leadership. And we're going to take you through a case study around just a recent case study about how shared leadership helped a particular senior leadership team. And then we'll end with just sharing a few tips, practical tips that you can just take away with you and use beginning as soon as this webinar is over about how you can help leaders within your organization or your client organizations move to some notions of shared leadership. So let's get going. Let's start with the exploring how the notion of leadership, what we expect of leadership, has changed dramatically throughout the years. So I'm not going to take us all the way back to the beginning of time, but let's go back to the 60s and early 70s and look at what was expected in the leadership space. So early on, management, we weren't really even talking about leadership, right? We were talking mostly about management. And usually you had a pretty homogeneous group of people, and oftentimes the manager was promoted from within the work group. And the expectations were pretty simple. You were supposed to be able to communicate expectations well, like tell these direct reports what you expect of them. You were supposed to let them know how they did relative to these very clear expectations. And you had a little bit of individual contributor responsibilities, but not a lot. Most of what you were doing was managing often sort of these 6 to 10 direct reports. As time went on, as we moved into the middle of the 70s, there started to be a more robust development culture. And so we went from not just communication and feedback, but there was this idea that you were supposed to help these direct reports become more effective, build the managerial pipeline. This is the beginning in the 70s where we started to hear this phrase, do more with less. So you had to cap your head count. You weren't going to get any more money in your budget, but your goals were increasing. So the idea was do more with less. Change was starting to become a more regular idea in the workplace. And so as a leader, you were expected to manage change, both the mechanics of change and the human reaction to change. As a result of that, both do more with less and manage change, now we started to see innovation come into the leadership landscape. You were supposed to be an innovative leader, thinking of different ways to do more with less. During this time, the expectation for what work groups were going to produce increased. And so the goals started ratcheting up, right? So do more with less became higher and higher in terms of goal expectations. This is also the time, although it's taken a while for this to actually take hold, but there was some sensitivity training. And basically what it meant, particularly when it started, was we weren't going to tolerate screaming at direct reports as frequently as we allowed it before. As we moved into the 80s and into the 90s, things became more complex. Technology started influencing more the way we were doing work. Businesses got more complex. More people were entering into the marketplace, making the competitive landscape more complex. And so leaders were expected to be effective at handling complexity. We were flattening out organizations during this time, right? Diminishing the hierarchy. So we moved more individual contributor responsibilities over to the leadership roles. So now people were about half-time individual contributors and half-time leaders. Enter in the concept of executive presence, right? How this really came into being when we were starting to talk really boldly about what's the difference between management and leadership. And this idea of this amorphous idea, by the way, still in 2020, there isn't agreement on what this means, but this idea of executive presence to really show yourself as a leader. Coaching, as we moved into the 90s, became more and more a means of developing people. And as organizations understood how helpful it was, but also how expensive it was, we now expected leaders to begin to become effective coaches. Diversity and inclusion became a much more important element of thinking about organizations and therefore thinking about leadership as we went into the late 90s. As we went into the 2000s, we grabbed this VUCA idea from the military: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. This was the shift from managing change as an event to it's always going to happen, so you need to be effective as a leader. And so that brought on the idea of agile leadership. You never know what's going to happen. You have to be quick on your feet. You have to be able to turn on a dime. And then we talked more about global leadership, right? Competitors are global, our customers are global, our vendors are global. It's a global mindset. And so we need leaders. By the way, we never really defined this very well, but we need leaders who have a global mindset. Employee engagement has now become ubiquitous. Every leader is now expected to build employee engagement. So when employee engagement came on the scene, it was more an HR kind of expectation that HR would measure and HR would put programs in. But as it became more commonly used and individual leaders got their scores, there was the expectation that individual leaders would become effective at building employee engagement. Mindfulness came on the scene around 2010. There were a number of organizations in Silicon Valley who were making great claims about how mindfulness was helping productivity and helping teamwork. And so it's made its way into the organizational space of leaders need to be mindful, and leaders need to, in some cases, teach or encourage mindfulness in others. Of course, setbacks are happening. We are winning and losing at different rates. Change is happening very quickly. And so we need leaders who can bounce back quickly and be resilient. And as technology became just, handheld, desktop, laptop, all these different technologies came in, we coined this phrase, we mean the broader we, digital leadership. You needed to be effective digital leader. Of course, nobody has a real definition for that, but that's the expectation that we see it showing up on competency models. So here we are in a global pandemic. And now a high percentage of leaders and their teams are working remotely. So where remote leadership was more incidental across the leadership population, it has become much more central. The idea that both leaders need to balance home and family with work, leaders need to help navigate that within their teams. So here we are in this space. And of course, I'm sure many of you are thinking that there are things not on this list. That is true. There are more things that, depending upon the industry you're in, the role that you're in, the country that you're in, the specific context that you're in, there is even more on the list, right? So this is where we are in that leadership space. And so as you map the growing expectations for leaders, and I think we would be naive to think we're capping the list where we are now, right? As the world becomes more complex, as the workplace becomes more complex, as we understand the dynamics of human beings more, particularly with the insights we're getting from neuroscience, we are just going to continue to have growing expectations around leadership. So we wanted to share with you a little bit about what was influencing our own, from the inside, our own understanding that there was imperative for shared leadership. So just give you some insights on the research space. So first, just understanding what we expect from leaders is a lot, not only as the walkabout we just did, but as we do our research, we have a really clear understanding that our expectations of leadership are not only high, but they vary based on context. And I'll just give you one example. We have done a lot of research around what it means to be an effective leader at different levels organizationally. And what our research shows is that as you go through each of these leaps, the expectations grow. And they get more significant as you go higher in the organization. But it's not just that the expectations that lead to effectiveness grow, they become more complex. So as an individual contributor, highly effective leaders place less emphasis on the behavior that we call structuring, being organized, laying out procedures and processes. But when you go to become a first line manager, that behavior becomes more important in terms of being effective. But then as you go to become a first line manager to a middle manager, you need to moderate that, tone it down a little bit. And as you go up to a senior manager, you need to not rely on that. So we're expecting this ebb and flow, this sort of sophisticated, nuanced way of relying more and less on leadership, different leadership behaviors as we move through these levels. And that's just one vantage point, right? You can imagine as we move to different functions, as we look at leadership in different industries, leadership is complex and it's contextual. So what we expect varies based on that. So let's also just take a minute and talk about leaders as individuals, right? Diversity and inclusion has been in the nomenclature for about 3.5 decades now. Of course, recently it has become stronger in the spotlight, if you will. Now, more commonly, the phrase is diversity, equity, and inclusion, really incorporating the element of equity or fairness in the space. So we are compelled, right, to think of leaders personally, right, to think of who they are. Many of you know MRG's research around country differences, and that context of country makes a big difference in the norms of leadership and how leadership is viewed. But even when we look at very specifically the individual leaders, I'll just give you 2 examples of our research. We look at, as you know, if you've been hanging around us for any amount of time, we look at gender patterns in leadership frequently. This is just an example of one study where we looked globally at leadership. And in our leadership assessment, we look at 22 different behaviors. And of those 22, when we look at gender patterns of leadership, 14 of them are different based on gender. Some really slight differences and some more moderate differences. So just in the landscape of gender patterns, and in this case, defining gender in traditional ways, in that binary way, we see differences. What about generational patterns? We've done a lot of research in the space and looking at generational patterns relative to age patterns. And if you're interested in that, we're happy to share the series of work that we've done in this area. But looking at generational differences just in the US, not even taking into account globally, almost half of the behaviors are different based on generation. So we know that we expect a lot from leaders, that those expectations change as they move in different roles and in different levels. And we are dealing with a very diverse set of leaders. When we think of all the things that go into who the individual is, right? So how can we expect single leaders to have all of this insight, right? All of this capability. So I'm going to tell you what for us really tipped the scales if they needed to be tipped in this shared way. And we have participated in a number of conferences that the Neuro Leadership Institute has put on. We've developed some nice relationships over the years. And in 2013, they reached out to us and asked if we would support Matt Lieberman, who is a social cognitive neuroscientist at UCLA, in some research that he wanted for a book that he was writing called Social, to encapsulate his research. And his research is very much around what we know about the brain as it relates to how the brain understands self in relationship to other. And so what he was asking for was research looking at leaders who were very relationship focused, but not results focused, leaders who were results focused, but not relationship focused. And then, of course, you know, the holy grail that probably we've been looking at as long as we've been studying management and leadership, right, is the leaders who are both high on being relationship focused and being results focused. And so this is an Anglo study. It is almost 18,000 leaders from the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK who have completed MRG's LEA 360 assessment between 2014 and 2019. This is an upgraded version of the original research that we did. So the first thing that we looked at when we looked at that combined is what percentage of those almost 18,000 leaders were in the top third ranking for both being very relationship focused and results focused. So just to take a minute in your head and guess a percentage, what percentage were rated as essentially high on both, right? Very results focused and very relationship focused. If you guessed less than 0.5%, you are right on. Less than half of those almost 18,000 leaders, less than half of a percent of those 18,000 leaders were high on both. So you can imagine we were startled by that result. And so what we did was we said, okay, top third, high on both is probably practically not necessary. So what about looking at just being in the top half of both relationships and results? That seemed more practically relevant. You were above the midline for both of these. So take a guess in your mind on this. And if you guessed just above 3%, then you win the prize. So this was startling. The initial research that we did, the numbers were actually even a little bit more favorable than this. We keep redoing this so that we can see if the population changes at all. It doesn't. We were a little chagrined, actually, and a little hesitant in bringing this research back to Matt Lieberman. But he ended up being thrilled with the results, and we'll share the link that make perfect sense. Well, we learned in talking to him that the brain has two separate neural networks. One neural network really focuses on what he calls social thinking, self-awareness, like who am I in relationship to the people around me. It focuses on collaboration and communication. It does the kind of meta-analysis on, am I being authentic? Is this other person being authentic? Is this person trustworthy? It's that whole relational piece of our brains. And then there's a separate neural network that focuses on that analytic thinking, that the non-social thinking and acquiring broad knowledge. And it's also where the more results-oriented non-people thinking goes. And what he shared with us is those two neural networks operate in what he calls a neural seesaw. When one is active, the other becomes dormant. And we all switch back and forth between these two neural networks. But in fact, almost all of us, have a preference to default to one of these neural networks over the other. And of course, you've probably heard neurons that fire together, wire together. The more we use a neural network, the thicker it becomes, the faster it operates, the more our brain tends to default to that neural network. So we are reinforcing, if we're more relationship focused in our leadership, we're reinforcing that social thinking neural network. If we're more results oriented, we're reinforcing that non-social thinking neural network, right? So if we look at just the biology, the neurobiology, it suggests it's hard to be equal in both of these, right? So here we are, we have that brain thing going on. We have all these high expectations of leadership. We have all the diversity of leadership and people coming into leadership. So it's no surprise, I think, that it's time to shift, right? It's time to shift our thinking and how we understand how leadership across an organizational entity actually gets accomplished. So let's take a minute and do a quick poll and level set to find out where everybody is. Think about, just sort of do this quick meta-analysis, right? Of the leaders that either you work with internally, or if you're a coach or consultant, of the leaders you work with in client organizations, roughly how many of them still expect that individual leaders actually can have a level of mastery, or at least a level of competency, across this very broad range of leadership expectations. Do you think that still most people are walking around going, yes, yeah, sure, leadership is a hard gig, but the really good ones can do it all? Are you starting to see a shift, and maybe about half of them are still thinking this? maybe only a few. Maybe you're in a rare situation where the leaders that you work with have already moved into this idea of a shared approach to leadership.
Thanks, Tricia. Thanks for logging in with those votes, everyone. I'll give you just another moment or two, and also encourage folks to go ahead and put questions. Also, we'll be stopping for a Q&A break in just a moment or two. So if you have any questions at all that have come up, now's a great time to put those in. And we'll just finish calculating the votes and share these results. We won't make you wait days for these. How about?
Oh, cool.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have 57% say most of them, 23% say about half, 18% say a few, and just 2% say almost none.
Two are in Nirvana. All right. So, this is our position at MRG. The leadership demands have become too complex for any single individual to master. It is now, I think, the time where we need to think about leadership as something that needs to happen across the full organizational landscape. And that the leader, him or herself, needs to be thinking about, how do I contribute to this? And then how do I build mechanisms for shared leadership? And so we are, I guess I would say, we're on a mission, right? To really squash this myth that the heroic leader who can do it all actually is the norm to aspire to. So why don't we just take a minute and see if we have questions to share?
Thanks, Tricia. So one question that came up, can you speak to how this relates to competency models and how you deal with encountering a competency model that's asking for a heroic leader?
Oh, that's such a good question. There was a moment in time a few years ago where competency models were kind of starting to lose ground in favor of a more succinct statement of values. But that sort of stalled out. And so we're still seeing a lot of competency models. And if you're like us, you have seen competency models where you could add leaps tall buildings in a single bound as the 13th competency, and it would seem like it fit well with the matrix, because we're asking too much of leaders. But if we can just shift the mindset, not in terms of necessarily shrinking the competency model, but instead understand that we're building a competency model for an organization, or even for a team, but not for an individual leader. And so we can be talking about, how do we build shared leadership to actually have all these competencies across the system or across the team or across the group, but not within the body of one leader. That would be awesome.
To keep us on time, I'm going to go ahead and let us move on, but do keep putting those questions in. We have another Q&A break, so please continue to add those in, and we'll make sure to come back to them either during the broadcast or afterwards. So please keep them coming. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lucy. And thanks, Tricia, for that wonderful setup. What's just most interesting to me, I think the group got it right in terms of that poll. And when you take that poll in relation to the research that Tricia shared right before it, it presents sort of an interesting picture, right? It really presents a picture of a lot of leaders out there trying to do it all, and really at no fault of their own. They're probably coming up short in some way or another. And it's just because what is being asked of them is just too much, and the expectations are just too great. And the variety at which they are being asked to pursue excellence is again too much. So I'm here today to really present a quick case study to you about some work that I did recently, where it was just some team development work for an organization that I'll talk about here in a second. And this work really centered around team dynamics and how we could implement the idea of a shared approach to leadership. This was a group of people who really was not a group of misfits, but a group that was relatively high performing, but they were really hoping to get better together. And so we implemented a few different aspects of shared leadership along with some assessments to head down this path. And that's what I'm going to share with you here today. Just so you're aware, I'm going to be talking about the LEA 360 today. Tricia has already made mention of it. I know that many of you on the call today are LEA certified, so you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. For those of you who are not, just very briefly, the LEA is our assessment that speaks about leadership behavior and would really measure frequency of behavior. So it really talks about what leadership behaviors would leaders be emphasizing versus not, what behaviors would they be prioritizing versus not. And when you have the 360 version or the multi-rater version of this, you get a nice picture of how a leader feels like they are showing up, and then also how they are being experienced by their observers, right? So a really full picture of how their leadership behavior is being presented. It also is accompanied by another assessment called the Leadership Impact Report, or the Leadership Part B of the LEA. And this is I will call it the more evaluative side of this assessment. It talks about the leadership competencies and whether or not leaders have a skill or ability within a particular competency. So while the LEA itself and those 22 leadership behaviors is just about frequency of behavior, the competency side of it is much more evaluative in terms of skill or ability, but is also critical toward our ability to run a lot of the research that we do, including the research that Tricia shared just a few minutes ago. So again, this will be these are the 22 LEA behaviors, and just the reason for this slide is just letting you know that these sit within 6 different leadership functions, and these behaviors sitting within each of these functions all really share a common theme or a common objective, whether that be really the thinking space of leadership inside of creating a vision, or really we'll call it the execution side of things, or pushing for results in terms of achieving results. These are how the behaviors are set up, and really represents the leadership model as we see it. So let's set this case study up. So the organization that I did this work with was a nonprofit healthcare organization. Not a new organization, been around for some time. And historically, the mission and the goal of this organization was focused on serving the community. And focused on serving the community in much more of a reactive way, right? So people get sick, they come to our locations, and we tend to them, right? And that is the way that this organization has functioned for its entire existence. Over the past couple of years, the organization has had I'll call it a change in management, new CEO, and then also a change in, I'll say, a vision or mission or goal to move from a reactive to a proactive model of healthcare. And what they really meant was that, can we integrate ourselves into the community to actually prevent sickness versus just trying to treat it? Right. So it really was a relatively large change in mindset of going from that reactive to the proactive idea of healthcare, and how can we just keep people healthier across the board versus just dealing with them when they get sick or ill. And so the team that I worked with was the executive team, so the senior team of 6. And as I mentioned earlier, this was a senior team of 6 that worked together for some time, were relatively close knit, were already highly performing, right? As I said, this is not a group of misfits. We weren't here to solve, really, gaping issues within this team or this organization. But again, they really recognized that this change in mission and change in goal and change in really their value proposition was going to be a challenge. I would also say, though, that this team was exhibiting some classic, I'm going to call them nonprofit issues. First being clarity. clarity among the 6 of them, but then also clarity to the organization. And I would say that this was heightened, again, in terms of this change in mindset or change in shift from the reactive to the proactive. Why are we doing what we are doing? What is expected of me? How are decisions being made? There was a lot of ambiguity there, not only within the team of 6, but then also I think that was disseminated out into the organization as well. Also some issues within decision making, and I would say more specifically when there was disagreement. So I would say disagreement amongst the team of 6 was not handled very well. It was more, there was disagreement in the air and everyone would get a little quiet and then we leave the room and then somehow down the road, the decision would get made. So sort of the decision-making process was a little bit, I don't want to say chaotic, but a little bit circuitous and maybe too deliberate at times. Then we also had a little bit of an accountability problem, not much so with the team of 6, but more so with them holding their teams and the teams accountable for the work that was being done. And then finally, a little bit of an interesting team dynamic, which I'll just mention here and I'll reference here again in a second, in terms of the team showing up and really putting into play or showing that everything is going well. My house is in order. Things are, we're making decisions, we're getting work done, we're moving forward, things are good. The truth probably was a little bit somewhere in between. So, they're in the room with the 6 of them, things seem very clean. They leave the room, things probably a little bit more messy than they might've been letting on. So what was the goal of the work that they brought us in for? The first was to use strategic directions, which I'll talk about in 2 seconds, and the enhanced LEA 360 composite report to really ferret out and then also address potentially some of the concerns that were going on with this team of 6 and then also potentially the broader organization. Again, we used the LEA 360. Before they did that, though, we utilized the strategic directions, which, again, if you're certified in LEA, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who are not, strategic directions is an offshoot of the LEA that allows organizations to identify and isolate the particular behaviors within the LEA that they really want to focus on, that they deem as important in terms of their short-term objectives and short-term goals over the next 2 or 3 years. So the strategic direction process allows them to isolate 6 to 8 behaviors potentially that they really want to focus on, that they really think are critical to ensure their success in the short term. And then the LEA 360, again, this group of 6 took the LEA 360 and we used their aggregate data with the enhanced LEA 360 composite report to, again, identify what some of the issues were and how we could potentially go about addressing the concerns. And then again, the broader goal here of promoting the idea of being better together and how could we utilize the idea of shared leadership in doing so. So I just want to share a couple pages from the LEA Enhanced Composite that were really critical toward this work. Again, because they had a strategic directions, one of the sections of this report is a strategic directions gap analysis. My point in showing you this page is not only I want to share with you what the strategic direction profile was, but also to give you a little bit of an idea of what some of the data was for this group. So these were the 8 behaviors that this group landed on, from innovative all the way through consensual. Just very briefly, I would say innovative, strategic, and persuasive is really, again, that thinking space of leadership and how do we convince people that this is the way to go. You've then got structuring, communication, feedback, and management focus, which is really the, I'm going to call it the execution side of leadership and really the, I'm going to say taking initiative in the accountability side of leadership. And then consensual at the bottom, I would say this was chosen because it was such a core tenet of this organization in terms of how decisions were being made, ensuring that people were being brought into the decision-making process, people were feeling heard, ideas were being heard, and people really felt like what they were bringing to the table was being valued. So this page was interesting to the group. I would say this one was even more interesting in terms of identifying what was going on and what is it potentially that they wanted to focus on. So this was, again, an offshoot of the strategic direction profile, the data that we just looked at, but isolating the behaviors that were potentially underutilized from this group. Again, we use the 360 version of the LEA, so you're seeing not only the self data, but the data from the boss, the peers, and the direct reports. And what really struck the group here is those purple dots. So the direct report responses to 5 of the 8 behaviors on the strategic direction profile. So you'll see that potentially there's some behaviors were being underutilized within this profile from the direct report point of view: persuasive, structuring, communication, feedback, and management focus. And I think what really hit this group of 6 were those 4, the last 4 that I just mentioned: the structuring through management focus. And they really wanted to dive a little bit deeper to understand what was going on and how potentially could they address these concerns. I think what sort of was the nail in the coffin for them in terms of identifying what it is that they wanted to focus and work on was the developmental opportunity section of the enhanced composite, which is derived from MRG research. So what we've done in this section is we have created a few competencies. One of them shown here is performance and results. We've done some research to identify which behaviors are most predictive in terms of success within that particular competency. And then we compare the data for the particular group to get some understanding about where things are going well and potentially there are some developmental opportunities. And what you'll see here again is, boy, there are a lot of up arrows or explore increased behavior for the direct report right side of things. So it was really reinforcing what was going on with the previous page or the behaviors potentially underutilized with the strategic direction profile. And then interestingly, just because I thought it was interesting and we did talk about it a lot, look at the peer group. Green check mark, green check mark, green check mark. So it was this really hammered the story of we show up as a group of 6, and it's not that we're pretending, but we really show up and put on this image that things are going great, right? That we really have everything under control, that we're making decisions and performance is occurring at a good pace. And then you leave the room, and again, that direct report side of things is, it's a little bit messier than I think potentially we're letting on. So after we, went through these a couple of sections, they really wanted to start talking about the execution side of things and the execution side of things with themselves and also with the direct reports. I know this is a really busy slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but what I want to just show here is how we started moving toward this idea of shared leadership, right? So we had this, and this is just 3 of the profiles within this group. We've got the CEO, the Director of Innovation and Strategy, and the Director of Services. And these are their individual profiles. The CEO had his responsibilities that like a normal CEO would have. Director of Innovation and Strategy was really, I'm going to say, the right-hand woman for the CEO in terms of being a thinking partner and ensuring that the organization was thinking about things in the correct way and really keeping a strategic mindset in terms of why they were doing things. And then you had the Director of Services, which really, I'm going to say, an ops role, and was really critical toward the historical aspect of the organization, ensuring that the services side of the organization was functioning, right? So this individual would oversee all of the locations where services would be delivered, overseeing the nurses and the technicians and all of that. So this really is the person who is maintaining the operational side of the organization. And you'll see here that I've highlighted 4 behaviors, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. But structuring, communication, feedback, and management focus. All 4 of these are within the strategic direction profile. And we're going to hone in on the direct report observations from these 4 behaviors, right? So this is the same data you saw on the previous slide, just a little bit easier to take a look at. So again, we've got the CEO, Director of Innovation Strategy, Director of Services. And these are their scores across these 4 behaviors for structuring, communication, feedback, and management focus. What I want to say here is a couple of things. First of all, these behaviors are really critical toward the execution side of leadership, right? Structuring is about being planful and being detail-oriented really before things even get started, right? People who score high in this behavior are people who are leaders who would say, I like to have a plan in terms of how things are going to get done. Leaders who score lower on this dimension are people who will say, let's just get started and we'll figure it out as we go along. Communication not only is this idea of being a conduit of information, but it also is about being very articulate in terms of your expectations, right? Letting people know what is expected of them. Feedback is about delivering feedback in a candid and straightforward manner, whether it be good, bad, or otherwise. Feedback is just about letting people know how they're doing against expectations. And then finally, management focus, really important behavior in terms of leadership, And it really is, I'm going to call it the sort of, when you think of classic leadership behaviors, they're really encompassed within management focus about, taking initiative, being willing to sort of push the accountability button, and being okay being out in front and enjoying, I'm going to say, facilitating the work of other people. So what do we see here? The first thing that I want to pull out here is, as a whole, this group as a whole has relatively low scores on all 4 of these behaviors. The majority of the scores are sitting at 40, 45 or below, right? And so that's just something to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this. The second thing is just take a look at that blue line, the CEO, right? He's a great guy. But he's sitting very low across all 4 of these execution side behaviors. And when you think back on terms of the research that Tricia presented, in terms of that task oriented or that performance side of things, that neural seesaw, where's he sitting? He's sitting much more on that relationship side of things, and that is his priority, right? So that's just something else I want to pull out. There's also, there's some clumping of scores here, but also some important disparities. And this is where we really get into the shared leadership side of things, right? So the director of services, that gray line, she's got the highest score in structure and highest score in communication, highest score in feedback, but then the lowest score in management focus, right? And then the director of innovation and strategy, so she is sort of sitting in the middle, but with a higher score in communication, and then importantly, very high score in management focus. What's interesting about this, though, right, is that the person who is in charge of operations, the person who is in charge of getting things done, the person who really needs to be, out there, out in front, has the lowest management focus score. She's doing the work, right? She's higher in structuring, she's higher in communication, she's higher in feedback, at least in relation to the other folks on the team, or at least the other 2 folks here. But in terms of, being really comfortable out in front, she's got a really low management focus score there. So this is, again, where we really get into the shared leadership space. And so first of all, just the execution and the results side of things really is a concerning area. I think the feedback here really cemented this for this group. And I would say a couple of things here. First of all, the group wasn't surprised that the director of services had some of the higher scores on the execution side of things. But it was interesting in terms of, okay, what can we learn from you in terms of these behaviors that we might need to be implementing more? And then also, really importantly, how can we support you? I think what they really recognized here was how much of this work was rolling up to her. And they were relying upon her, and not even potentially knowing it, to do, to be a little bit more planful, to really communicate what the expectations, to really deliver the feedback. And so they really came to this place of how we can support you. And then finally is this twist on management focus, right? And there was something, I'm going to share an anecdote here in a second that I think really crystallized this for this group, and really crystallized how shared leadership is important for them moving forward. But again, the ops, or the director of services, lower score here, and her role was getting it done. But being out in front was, I'm going to say, a little bit taxing for her. She clearly was one of the, I'll just call it, meekest people in the group, right? But she was also working very hard on many of these behaviors to ensure that things were getting done. And then you've got the director of innovation and strategy, who really isn't, responsible for getting things done. Is more of a thinking partner of the CEO, and she's got the highest management focus score of the group by a long shot, right? And the story that I want to share here that really crystallized this for this group is, let's go back 6 months to March and April. And I know for some of us, it probably feels like yesterday. For others, it probably feels like 19 years ago, but COVID is upon us. Right. And it creates just an immense amount of confusion, ambiguity, and what the heck is going on. And organizations are having to move quickly, right? Okay, how do we handle this? How do we do what decisions do we need to make? What do we need to put into place? And the CEO in this organization, love him, but not a sweet spot for him. And he was relying upon his normal way of making decisions. In terms of being very consensual, very deliberate, ensuring that everyone was aligned, and not really wanting to ruffle any feathers. And they were a couple weeks into this when the director of innovation and strategy pulled him aside and said, "Hey, this has got to stop. You got to make some decisions here. You got to make some calls. You got to make them quick. You got to be okay with ruffling feathers, because if we don't do it, we're going to be in a lot of trouble." It was an eye-opening experience for him. As I'm talking about shared leadership, he's the one who shared this story to me and the group. And it really crystallized for the group how important it is for them to work together, and how they can utilize each other's strengths to ensure that they are doing their best work, not only for themselves, but for the organization. And that story, I think, really helped them understand, what it is that they needed to focus on together as a group, how they could rely upon each other a little bit more fundamentally in terms of how things are getting done, and where also some of their strengths and potentially areas for opportunity were, and how they could come together to work together. So I think this is a great sort of case study in terms of really understanding and pushing for moving toward a model of shared leadership. I mean, between the research that Tricia has shared, the poll that you all put in there, and then this is a little case study here and some data, that shared leadership really is an effective way of potentially working together. Because you'll have access to the deck here after the webinar, I just wanted to throw in some coaching prompts to help identify what some shared leadership opportunities might be. I used several of these in the work that I did and with this group, and I think that this is a great starting point for anyone who's thinking about potentially venturing down this shared leadership path, and this is a great starting place. So these are here for your reference. Okay, any questions while I transfer it back to Tricia for a wrap up here?
A few great ones are coming in, and keep them coming, folks, because we will follow up if we don't have a chance to answer them right away. But Drew, one quick question for you. How many people can you put in that report, in that composite report?
That is a good question. I don't know that there is a limit off the top of my head, but we will confirm.
There isn't a limit.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Georgia. So yeah, no limit at all.
Some really great ones are coming in, but I do want to make sure Tricia can wrap up. So if we have time, we'll do a couple more at the end, and then we will have all of these answers will come to you via email as well. When we do the Q&A, we'll have a follow-up blog post that'll have all of these, and everyone please read it, because there were some great questions coming in. So I will move us forward, but do keep asking.
Great, thanks to both of you. So let's talk a little bit. Those coaching questions are great, but we also have some tips that you can use more systemically. So let's move to that. But before we do, let's check in. Now that you're sort of thinking about more this idea of shared leadership, how many of the leaders that you work with are actually practicing some form of, and I'm going to emphasize this, intentional shared leadership? Right, they're working closely with others. They're using the examples like Drew illustrated in the case study. They're inviting people in. I know you have the skill that I don't have. They're reaching out to others and saying, I can see you're struggling with this. I'm happy to help. How many of the leaders that you're working with are practicing some form of intentional shared leadership, whether it's just an advice exchange or they're actually working more collaboratively together to take care of the broader range of leadership expectations and needs? It's coming. I was going to drum roll. Oh, good. So this is nice.
Yeah, about let's see, 10% said most of them, 28% said about half, 52% said a few of them, and 10% almost none.
It's interesting, right? You kind of wonder how many are doing it out of desperation, but I guess desperation sometimes leads us to the right path. So I'm going to just briefly share with you, Drew shared the coaching prompts, which are really helpful to get people thinking about shared leadership in an individual context or in a team context. But there are 6 ways that more systemically you can think about shared leadership. So one is the most formal way, right? With projects or even tasks to formalize the idea that we start from the beginning, we're going to do this together. And we spend time thinking about, this is the skill set I have, this is the skill set you have. We actually do this in our organization, of really looking at, and it's not just oftentimes 2 people. We sometimes have 3 or 4 people who are all taking a leadership role in particular projects. So really, but formalizing it so that people know we're doing this together, and here's my role and skill set, and here's your role and skill set. This is how we'll navigate this. This is absolutely my favorite go-to for a shared leadership strategy because everybody can use it. I always say to people when I'm coaching, and I'm looking at their data and I'm saying, well, you're not as strategic, but you're really good at communication, or you're not as persuasive, but you're very innovative. It's like, who around you that you respect does this behavior or this part of leadership really well? And can you invite them into a thinking partnership? Can you take the problems, the opportunities, the decisions that you need to make and use them as a thinking partner? And what it does is, not only is it great for the brain because it opens up the mind to different possibilities, but it takes the burden away from the individual of, I need to be strategic, but it's really hard for me, or I need to be more persuasive, but I don't have yet that full skill set built. So this idea of thinking partnerships is a great model. Particularly, it's also a great model to help people enter into the idea of shared leadership. We also talk to leaders who are running teams as running them like micro-organizations. You know, nobody bats an eye when the CEO has a head of marketing and a head of finance and a head of sales and a head of technology and a head of manufacturing. It's like, of course, everybody has their defined roles, and there's an expectation that they're going to carry with it a particular leadership lens. I ask leaders who are running teams, like, again, what are you good at? What behaviors do you have? Where do you go naturally? What's missing in terms of what your department or your team needs? And who on your team has that skill set, has that mindset? And how do you build that sort of system together so that, again, as Drew's example showed, that we've got it all covered if we look at all of us. So how do we create the space so that we can together span more of the leadership need, span more of the competency model, right? I like to encourage people to look for peer mentors and or peer coaches. I find that people relax a little bit more when they're working with people at equivalent levels to them. So a peer mentor is somebody you're specifically trying to learn something from. You know, this person really drives results higher and higher in a constructive way through their department more than I do to mine, and I want to learn how they do that. So I'm going to ask that person to be my mentor in stretching for results. Peer coaching is more sort of egalitarian. We're coming together to help each other. And, you know, as most, if not all of you know, what coaching really is asking open-ended questions, listening with a level of insight, and reflecting back to the individual. So if we can do that with each other as peers, and then sprinkle in some peer insights and maybe even advice, again, I'm not alone in the space, and I'm expanding my leadership repertoire, I'm expanding my leadership perspective, and also the kind of the added benefit of not feeling alone. Peer advisory groups are more formal, where you almost use them as a board, right? So it's more formal and you'd use it a little bit less frequently, but it's a group that you would go to where the actual role is to listen to the situation and to provide advice, right? It is, the intention is, I'm going to share with you what I would do in your situation. And so the individual who is asking the advisory board has the opportunity to hear a bunch of ideas and take them away to think about them, right? A peer advisory group usually asks, you know, for those of you who know things like mastermind groups or Vistage or Women's President Organization or Young's President Organization, that's what those are, is I listen and I give you advice from my own experience. And then finally, really helping to facilitate a less hierarchical mindset of leadership. And I will tell you, the number one way to begin to change the mindset about this is to coach leaders to ask for feedback from people more junior than them in the organization, including their team, and to be very good at asking and taking in the feedback. That seems to be the number one way of people saying, oh, yes, she has the title, but she doesn't live in the hierarchy, right? That we are modeling the idea that leadership learning happens up, down, and sideways, right? So really working with that less attentiveness to the title, right? And if we're talking about shared leadership, I can share it with people above me who are my peers, or I can share it with people who are more junior than I am. So, we're in this crazy time, right? This pandemic now, and we would just say, now even more than ever, people are feeling more vulnerable. So the idea that I'm not in this alone. When we are in these vulnerable, uncertain times, we default to habitual patterns of thinking and acting. So we tend to, on our own, we narrow our approach to leadership. So again, that shared space helps me not go in those well-trodden routes. Connection and support are even more important when folks are feeling so isolated. So shared leadership gives me a platform for connection and support. And of course, it's really hard to take perspective on our own when we're in these times of uncertainty. So this shared leadership gives us the opportunity for better perspective taking. So here we are. It's getting harder and we're in a more uncertain time. The demands of leadership are not going to stop growing. And we're going to, as a world, hopefully continue to commit to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we just think that the case is really strong to shift to this paradigm of shared leadership.
Thanks, Trisha. Thanks everyone for staying with us as we get to the end of the hour. You will get all of these materials, the slides, the recording, some great Q&A will come out of this. Continue to throw those in the box if you have a minute before you go. You'll get all of that via email very soon. And please, if you are registered in the LEA, we're actually doing a very interactive workshop coming up about this enhanced composite report. And a lot of these great questions that came in were a little bit practical about what are we really doing when we get into it? And this is going to be a great opportunity for that. It is free. You do need to be LEA certified and space is limited. So just hop over to mrg.com now and go to the calendar and you'll find that workshop there as well as some other events coming up. If you're not certified in the LEA, our next certification starts on November 24th, and that's actually in US evening time. And so that works for some folks. And we'll have more LEA certifications coming in the new year as well. So I will let everyone go. Thanks again so much for joining us. Send any questions you continue to have our way and keep an eye out on your inbox for all these great materials. Thanks again. Stay well, and we'll see you next time.